The Vory Zakone are a unique Soviet phenomenon that can only be compared to the prison Camorra of Italy. But while the Camorra was created and gained power in the turbulent environment of revolutions, the Vory Zakone were on the contrary, a response to strong state power and mass repression. The Vory Zakone, often translated as Thieves-in-Law, emerged not simply as a criminal group, but as an alternative power behind barbed wire. They became the living embodiment of the paradox of the Soviet era. The state, which sought total control, itself gave rise in its prison camps to a closed, brutally organized anti-system. With its own constitution called concepts, its own budget called common funds, and its own, to some extent religious, rituals and philosophy. Thieves-in-Law are a distorted but recognizable mirror reflecting the structure and methods of the state that spawned them. An iron hierarchy, a cult of power, terror as a tool of control, a series of total prohibitions. All this was the flip side of the Soviet project. Its dark double, but this double would also change, just like the state. And if you're interested in hearing about the evolution of the thieves, from prison idealists to pragmatic masters of the shadow economy, then meet the Thieves-in-Law on the other side of the law. Crime has always existed, including in the Russian Empire. There was also organized crime for which the 1917 revolution was as serious a test as it was for the rest of the population. It's no secret that crime is directly linked to state laws and social norms. In the conditions of civil war, all norms are violated, sometimes irrevocably. However, after its end, a conditionally peaceful life always begins, as was the case in the USSR. The first decade after the Civil War was a very specific period. The new economic policy, NEP, provided many opportunities for the growth of organized crime, as there were many targets for crime, rich NEP men. However, this period was short-lived. Reality quickly changed, and this change affected everyone, both ordinary citizens and the criminal community. Mass repression began, which formed a completely new criminal phenomenon, Thieves-in-Law. It was in December 1929 when Stalin proclaimed a policy of eliminating the kulaks, or Soviet peasants, as a class. Mass arrests began. The state, expanding its control over society, moved from fighting the NEP men and the outlaws associated with their activities to the targeted suppression of entire categories of so-called enemies and saboteurs. A flood of people arrested on political or social charges, e.g. espionage, sabotage, counter-revolutionary activity, or being a socially dangerous element, poured into the Gulag camps. This led to a radical change in the demographics of the camp population. Criminal prisoners who had previously dominated the camp environment found themselves in a significant minority against the backdrop of the mass of convicts under these articles. It was precisely the flooding of this traditionally criminal environment with a mass of prisoners who did not belong to such a world and were perceived as outsiders that became the key factor in the formation and then consolidation of the concept of the Vory Zakone, or thief-in-law. Faced with the threat of erosion of their power, loss of control over Gulag life, and the need to consolidate in the face of a huge number of outsiders, the traditional criminal elite began to actively formalize and tighten their laws, rituals, and hierarchy. The figure of the thief-in-law simply emerged from a respected authoritative outlaw in conditions where prisons ceased to be places of confinement for criminal offenders and became true institutions for the masses. However, the foundation of the emerging thieves' law was laid in the crime culture of the Russian Empire, which underwent a brutal breakdown but retained key elements that subsequently merged with another tradition deeply rooted in Russian soil, peasant communality. By the beginning of the 20th century, the pre-revolutionary underworld was a complex structure with its own hierarchy, specializations, and unspoken code of conduct. Despite the absence of a unified centralized mafia in the usual sense, stable criminal clans and centers of influence had formed. Of particular importance was the figure of the brodyaga, or vagrant, specific bandits who engaged in petty theft and had no family, children, attachments, or any other obligations. Although these vagrants were not among the most successful criminals, they still commanded respect among their peers. Vagrants were an ideological example of absolute rejection of the state. It was believed that this is what a real thief should be like, living off his own craft. This shows a trace of deep religiosity, where such a thief is perceived almost as a monk who has rejected everything except his goal, and this despite the fact that such vagrant thieves were almost never rich. Most often, it was other thieves who were rich, those whose main sphere of influence was related to large-scale thefts, burglars, boxmen or safecrackers, sniffers, thieves who broke into cash registers, aristocrats, a type of pickpocket who exclusively stole wallets mainly from the wealthy citizens in places where ordinary people could not even enter, and various types of bargainers. Often, said bargainer would give the thieves work himself, pointing out a place that would be convenient to rob, and then buy the stolen goods from them. However, it should be understood that these thieves were not rich by modern standards. They simply had enough money for a higher standard of living in a big city. They didn't become owners of large plots of land, income-generating houses, or businesses. They generally remained at the bottom of the social ladder in large cities, or moved to the outskirts of the empire, where, with their accumulated funds, they could start a new life. Among the numerous thieves, there were about 30 specializations. Those whose craft required technical skill had the highest status. Pickpockets represented the oldest thieving profession. Boxmen and sniffers were particularly respected figures. Robbers and murderers, on the other hand, were at the bottom of the hierarchy. Life was traditionally considered a gift from God, and taking it was only allowed in extreme cases, such as to protect oneself or loved ones. This was again influenced by religious norms. But despite their ideology, thieves' guilds were not highly organized. The most organized groups were horse thieves. Since horses were the basis of agriculture and transport, stealing them required the creation of large organizations with hundreds of members and a clear hierarchy. Such structures were the closest to classic organized crime. Similar features were possessed by close-knit groups of card sharps and counterfeiters. Fraudsters and counterfeiters constituted the intellectual elite of the underworld. Their operations with promissory notes, stocks, or jewelry, including marriage scams and false charity, required careful preparation and masterful execution. Counterfeiting money required not only artistic talent, but also considerable courage due to the severe penalties. This entire criminal community flourished in the unique conditions that arose at the turn of the young country's founding and in its early years. During this period, early Soviet crime was wild and free, existing in conditions of weak state control and general social anomie. However, from the mid-1920s, as the NEP was rolled back and the state grew stronger, the nuts and bolts of control began to tighten. The police grew stronger and power became more concentrated. This pressure on outlaws, who were accustomed to freedom, also attributed to the beginning of the formation of the Thieves' Code as an internal criminal code necessary for survival and consolidation in conditions of increasing repression. The exact date of birth of the first Thieves-in-Law is lost in the Gulag fog of the 1930s, but their formation is inextricably linked to this period. The arena was the overcrowded prisons and camps of the Gulag, where fierce confrontation between various groups of professional criminals was raging. In this environment, there were irreconcilable zhigans, seasoned ideological criminals who followed their own code and waged total war against the prison administration. Many zhigans were professional criminals who vehemently hated the Soviet regime, and they were more likely to commit serious violent crimes. They opposed the thieves as well as other authorities, but over time, they didn't simply disappear completely, but dissolved to such an extent that even the thieves were sometimes called zhigans. The bulk of active criminal elements consisted of ordinary urki, professional thieves and robbers who obeyed the thieves' hierarchy and its laws. Real power within the prison belonged to the blatnie, thugs with unquestionable authority who ruled internal life according to unwritten concepts, distributed resources, and were the guardians of thieves' traditions. It was the crucible of clashes between these groups, as well as with the authorities and non-criminal prisoners, in the harsh conditions of the camps of the 1930s, that the figure of the thief-in-law emerged as the new crowned prince of the criminal world. The first thieves had elite specializations. They were not just petty pickpockets. Their ranks included virtuosos of theft, apartment thieves who silently cleaned out homes, box thieves who opened safes with an almost jeweler's precision, and grocery thieves who emptied food stores at lightning speed. They saw themselves as the blue bloods, the aristocracy of the crime world, acting as if, for ideological reasons, fiercely opposing not only the hated state, but also the punks they despised. Petty thieves like tovekotyes, who stole laundry from clotheslines, or flyers who robbed kiosks. They were united by something immeasurably greater than criminal specialization: a fanatical desire to forge their own hardline order in the hell of prison camp chaos, to create an alternative universe with its own laws and authority. The absolute total control of the camp administration naturally gave rise to its mirror image, an equally ruthless anti-system: thieves' concepts. At the heart of this negotiation was a sacred principle, which has come down to two very famous formulations: no freedom in sight and no stepping with the authorities. Any cooperation with authorities, even if forced by torture or the threat of imminent death, was considered a mortal sin for a thief. He was obliged to remain an incompatible enemy of the state until the end. This negotiation extended to all social institutions, including family and legal work. The family were seen as shackles that bound the despised frayers, non-thieves, to the world. Labor for the state, even in captivity, was a strict taboo, seen as a direct aiding and abetting of the enemy. However, the concepts were not limited to the ideology of non-compliance. They created a detailed code for practical life, a complex system of survival and retention of power. Mutual responsibility, thieves' solidarity, was elevated to an absolute. A thief was obliged to lend a helping hand to a brother-in-law, to share the last piece of bread, to intervene in a deadly fight, to provide material support. To betray one of your own meant signing your own instant death warrant. The heart and foundation of this shadow state was the obshak, the community's common fund. The main source was doika, or tribute collection, the routine robbery of the majority of prisoners. This also included income from warehouse thefts, smuggling, and underground gambling. The money in the obshak was the lifeblood of the community. It was used to help thieves who had gotten into trouble, to bribe guards and administrators, and to finance brutal wars over zones of influence. The thieves assumed the role of supreme arbiters and guardians of order according to the code in their territory. They judged disputes between prisoners quickly, ruthlessly, and without appeal, and controlled the distribution of scarce resources such as rations, parcels, warm bunks, and places in the barracks. Their power, though based on fear and violence, brought a grim predictability to a world of absolute lawlessness. This spontaneously emerged system quickly acquired formal institutions of power and sacred rituals. It was unthinkable to become a thief-in-law of one's own volition. The highest title could only be bestowed at a shkodka, or meeting, a secret but mandatory gathering of active thieves-in-law. The candidate had to have had a solid criminal record, unquestionable authority, in other words, the right weight, in the criminal world, and an impeccable, by concept standards, biography, without any traces of cooperation with the authorities or other weak actions. The spirit of the person being crowned was very important. It was understood that he had to be physically above pain. For example, not even flinching when receiving a painful tattoo. In addition, the thief had to be sufficiently strong, both physically and morally. The coronation ceremony itself became a sacred act. Sometimes a symbolic crown was used, but more often it was simply a solemn proclamation of the new thief-in-law in front of his comrades. This meant accepting the full weight of the thieves' law and swearing allegiance to it until his last breath. Anyone who broke the oath was sentenced to death without the right to pardon. The shkodka was the supreme authority of the thieves' community in prison, and often in the whole region, which could include many prisons, a kind of parliament and supreme court in one. The fate of the community was decided at these secret forums. New thieves were crowned. Bloody conflicts between gangs or individual in-law members were resolved. Wars were declared, the common fund was distributed, and most importantly, death sentences were handed down to those who had broken the rules. The decision of the shkodka, taken by the collective will of the in-laws, was final and could not be appealed. To ensure the undivided power of the shkodka, overseers were appointed locally. These were authorized representatives of the thieves' elite in barracks, workshops, and individual camp points. Vigilantly monitored compliance with the concepts, reported problems upstairs, and ruthlessly ensured that the decisions of the assembly were carried out. Their power was based on the universal fear of the punitive power of the thieves community. Maintaining the inviolability of the concepts and the authority of the Thieves-in-Law relied not only on authority, but also on a system of total, demonstrative terror. Sanctions for violations were cruel, inevitable, and carried out publicly, like an edifying spectacle of horror. Minor offenses like insults, petty lies, and insubordination were followed by a public, ritual slap in the face. This was not just a blow, but an act of restoring the hierarchy, a visible demonstration of the absolute power of the law over the offender. A more severe punishment was called beating the ears, permanent expulsion from the thieves community. For a person whose life, safety, and very status depended entirely on belonging to the caste and its ironclad solidarity, this was tantamount to a slow, painful death. The expelled person became an outcast, a legitimate target for ridicule and violence from all sides. Often, they were later physically brutalized, either by the prisoners they had previously offended or by the verdict of a new meeting. The most common and merciless punishment was sudden death. It was applied for serious crimes against the foundations of the Thieves' Law: betrayal, especially collaborating with the authorities, theft from the common fund, and gross violation of key concepts, for example, refusing to show solidarity. The sentence was carried out brutally, immediately, and visibly, often right at the meeting. The relationship between this close-knit thieves hierarchy and the Gulag administration resembled a complex, dangerous dance on a knife's edge. On the one hand, the thieves loudly swore absolute, irreconcilable enmity towards the state and any of its manifestations, refusing to cooperate in the slightest. The camp administration, in turn, officially declared the Thieves-in-Law to be the worst enemies of the order, seeking to break their power by isolating them in punishment cells and solitary confinement, or by transferring them to the notorious MVD special camps, Osoblogs in Russian. On the other hand, there was a vast gray area of forced coexistence and tacit agreements that was vitally important for both sides. The administration, especially at the lower levels, such as camp commanders or guards, often benefited from the existence of this conceptual order among the criminal contingent. This gave rise to tacit agreements. The camp administration turned a blind eye to certain thieves' business, and the thieves ensured the appearance of calm and predictability in the prison by restraining the most violent elements. The key stabilizer in this precarious balance was the Old Common Fund. Money from the thieves' treasury flowed continuously to bribe guards and low-level officials. In exchange for food rations, tobacco, moonshine, or hard cash, the guards could turn a blind eye to thieves' meetings, pass on forbidden news, grant concessions to specific thieves, or look past minor violations. A kind of black office or secluded corner emerged, where guards and overseers could talk heart-to-heart and settle current issues, maintaining a fragile balance of terror and corruption. The political prisoners, those convicted under the infamous Article 58, counter-revolutionary crimes, stood apart in this system. For the Thieves-in-Law of the pre-war period, they remained outsiders, fraudsters of the highest order, often despised for their intelligence and ideals alien to the thieves' world. The political prisoners were one of the main targets of ruthless milking, a source of systematic robbery and humiliation. The thieves did not see themselves as potential allies against their common enemy, the state. They perceived them as yet another category of the prison's controlled population, a resource for survival and strengthening their own caste. Helping political prisoners was categorically not part of the code and was considered a disloyal weakness worthy of contempt. Despite the monstrous isolation and unimaginable cruelty of the Gulag, the thieves' concepts quickly spread throughout the gigantic camp empire, from Polar Vorkuta to the Kolyma mines. Prisoners who were transferred from camp to camp across the vast country in endless stages became living apostles and bearers of these rules. Common sacred rituals, a unified secret jargon, a hierarchy impenetrable to outsiders, and the dogma of an absolute taboo on cooperation with the authorities merged into the powerful, fully unified criminal structure. A thief-in-law arriving at an unfamiliar remote camp could present his invisible documents, his status, confirm it with his impeccable knowledge of concepts and hodka, his number of prison stays, and almost instantly occupy the highest position in the local hierarchy. By the turn of 1940, the phenomenon of Thieves-in-Law had finally taken shape as a formidable, autonomous force within the Soviet camp system, a natural product of its own monstrous logic of total suppression. However, the impending ordeal of the Great Patriotic War, part of World War II, would pose an unprecedented challenge to this newly formed community, splitting it into rival clans and marking the beginning of the bloodiest chapter in its history, the era of the Bitch Wars. In the summer of 1941, the situation for the USSR was catastrophic. The Nazi Wehrmacht was rapidly advancing deep into the country. The Red Army suffered colossal losses. Entire armies were surrounded. Key industrial and agricultural areas were under occupation. The country was in dire need of any human resources to save itself. In these conditions of despair and extreme military necessity, on July 12, 1941, the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR issued a decree on the release of the punishment of persons convicted of certain categories of crimes. This act caused a social explosion that undermined not only the foundations of the penitentiary system, but also the closed world of the professional criminal milieu, which strictly observed Thieves' Law. Formally, the decree provided, among other things, for the early release and conscription into the army of prisoners convicted of minor crimes. Repeat offenders, a category that traditionally included a significant portion of Thieves-in-Law, were not eligible for release. Various types of violent criminals who acted as a kind of security force for the Gulag system on behalf of the Thieves-in-Law were also not eligible. However, the realities of war quickly eroded these formal restrictions. The decree legitimized the very idea of using prisoners as a resource for the front and cheap labor of the rear. In practice, many inmates, including those formerly considered untrustworthy, often fell under its scope. But the main shock for the holders of thieves' ideals was the massive positive response within the camps to this call. For the thieves of the old school, who sacredly observed Thieves' Law, the very state initiative calling for cooperation through military service was blasphemy. However, the reality of the Gulag proved stronger than ideals. The inhumane conditions of 1941 to 1943 contributed significantly to this. Hunger in the camps became a major problem for all types of prisoners. Supplies to the camps were cut back significantly. Food for non-workers consisting of a few hundred grams of low-quality bread turned people into walking skeletons. Working in warm places, such as the kitchen, bakery, warehouse, medical unit, or in administration, gave the only chance to survive through access to additional food. Refusal to work in these conditions was tantamount to suicide. In addition, administrative pressure changed at this point, becoming more systemic and harsh. Opponents of the regime were immediately sent to solitary confinement, a cold kennel with meager rations, sometimes none at all, and being deprived of warm clothing. The terms were measured in days and weeks, and survival was extremely difficult. Beatings by prison staff in certain categories of prisoners were widely practiced. Transfer to extremely hard labor, logging with excessive quotas, mines, construction, and permafrost, was used both as punishment and to eliminate undesirables. Prisoners could be deprived of the right to correspond or receive parcels, which was sometimes a vital necessity, especially in the cold northern conditions. Patriotic feelings awakened in some prisoners, especially those convicted of political or everyday crimes. The news of the enemy's invasion resonated with them. The authorities skillfully exploited this, promising early release or the opportunity to redeem their guilt with blood. For these people, what would later be called shukavani was then seen as a chance to restore their names and contribute to the defense of their country. They were wrong from the thieves' point of view, who were not interested in the lives of ordinary prisoners. Rebellion against the thieves' oppression became another motive for joining the army. The right thieves existed by robbing ordinary inmates. They were the ones who established power in the barracks, collected tribute, and subjected others to humiliation and violence. Life under their yoke was unbearable for many, including from a moral point of view. Sometimes, especially in fiction, thieves are portrayed as defenders of prisoners from lawlessness of the state. But they forget that the thieves did not defend everyone. All of the motives presented rarely existed in isolation. Hunger was intensified by the fear of solitary confinement. Patriotism was mixed with despair at the hopelessness of the camp. The desire to escape from the thieves was fueled by the dream of an extra bowl of gruel. The mass phenomenon of suki, or bitches, was a direct consequence of the conditions of the wartime gulag and the activities of the thieves themselves. The insulting nickname bitch, which stuck to those who collaborated with authorities, clearly shows the depth of the divide and the ferocity of the split within the camp world. However, I would like to emphasize the war between the thieves and the bitches, which would flare up fiercely after the end of World War II, was not a war of good against evil. It was a war between two criminal factions that came together to defend their own principles, grinding ordinary prisoners in their millstones. The bitch wars put an end to the old thieves' ideals, especially the prohibition on thieves shedding blood except in self-defense. It also put an end to the principle of thieves not interfering in the affairs of the state, because in the conditions of a real civil war among prisoners, all means were acceptable. If at first during World War II the bitches in prisons were simply thieves who had chosen to have at least some contact with the state authorities, by 1947 the situation had changed dramatically. The fact is that those who would come to be called military men had returned from the war. As one thief fiercely accused a former soldier, "You were in the war? You picked up a rifle? Then you're a bitch, a real bitch, and you're subject to punishment under the Thieves-in-Law, because you're a coward. You didn't have the willpower to refuse to serve. Serve time or die, but do not take up a rifle." But the people who had been through the war were ready to fight for their right to be in charge, and were not prepared to agree to someone else's rules. That's when the real war began. It's one thing when a petty criminal snitches, but it's another when a respected thief with connections, influence, and status returns from war. According to the laws of the crime world, he's a traitor in the worst sense of the word. A thief-in-law who violated the ban and tarnished himself with ties to the authorities automatically became an outcast and a bitch, deserving only death. Authoritative people who came back from the war naturally did not want to die. In addition, the state authorities, well aware of the danger posed by the Thieves-in-Law, were ready to help the civil war in the criminal community. The principle of divide and conquer worked like clockwork. The Thieves faction included professional criminals who strictly adhered to the Thieves' Code. Their incredible ferocity was caused by the ideological nature of the war. The ideals that had defined their entire lives were being betrayed. This can best be compared to a religious war, where the enemy is destroyed simply because he's the enemy, and other reasons are merely background noise, especially for the rank-and-file fighters. On the other hand, there were the bitches. This term encompassed everyone who cooperated with the camp administration in one way or another. The core consisted of outlaws who had initially made a deal with the authorities for their own benefit, and, critically, for the military. Therefore, the bitches were never a unified structure. They were a disparate and diverse coalition forced to unite, including for the sake of self-preservation. Caught between these two forces was the bulk of the Gulag population, the musiki, or guys, petty thieves and repeat offenders on domestic charges, who did not belong to any ideological groups. Sometimes they obeyed the bitches in everyday matters, but they also recognized the moral authority and laws of the thieves. After 1947, the old hierarchy collapsed. The musiki became a bargaining chip and a battlefield. Both sides exerted enormous pressure on them, trying to force them to join or submit, extorting meager rations, forcing them to work for their sides, and demanding loyalty. It was practically impossible for the musiki to remain truly neutral. They were constantly forced to make a choice under the threat of violence. The ideological hostility between the two sides quickly escalated into fierce physical confrontation, a full-scale bitch war. The first organized clashes broke out at transit points, where rival groups collided, and then in prisons, when one group attempted to intimidate or deal with another. There are also known cases when groups of thieves or bitches who tried to pressure political prisoners or musiki were repelled. The open phase of the bitch wars conflict lasted from about 1947 to 1952. Its tactics and methods became apparent as early as the initial split. The bitches, having a numerical advantage thanks to the military and often real combat experience, were initially better organized for group action. The thieves, who traditionally relied on personal courage and authority, also created their own power groups. Terror became their main weapon. Conflicts broke out everywhere. In cramped barracks, at logging sites, in canteens, in bathhouses, anywhere the representatives of rival groups could meet, transit prisons turned into real battle arenas. However, it's quite difficult to speak about the real scale of the fighting. Too often, the only source of information is the memoirs of former inmates or even retellings of their stories. For example, according to the recollections of one thief who had been imprisoned since 1938, in 1947 the number of bitches in some camps exceeded the number of thieves by more than 10 times. He recounted how a little more than 10 thieves began cutting down the bitches and killed countless numbers of them. And one thief, who later ended up in the BUR, high security barracks, single-handedly killed 17 bitches with only a sharpened knife and survived. The boldness and strength of a particular side, of course, depended mainly on whose side the narrator was on. The scale of the terror was enormous. Incidents occurred almost daily in one camp or another of the vast Gulag system. A telling example is Intlag in 1948. The camp administration, according to some witnesses, deliberately released 150 armed bitches onto a crowd of about 100 blatnie, thief gang members. The result of the massacre was the surrender and renunciation of the code by 10 thieves. The rest were brutally murdered. The bitch wars dealt a devastating demographic and moral blow to the traditional thief community. Massive, well-organized attacks by bitches, often supported or even directed by camp authorities, led to the elimination of a significant portion of the ideological thieves. Killings on a scale similar to that of Intlag, where virtually an entire group of thieves was destroyed, were not uncommon. In addition, the administration used traditions against their own bearers in this war. At transit points, newly arrived prisoners were forced to undress so that thieves could be identified by their tattoos. Then they were given an ultimatum: a public renunciation of the code or death. The ritual of renunciation was often symbolic. The most banal, for example, was dividing one's rations with the bitches. Here I will quote one memory of a former prisoner. A former thief once explained to me that according to the old rules, if a thief calmly drank or ate with a bitch, he was automatically counted as one of the bitches. The bitch had to be killed, and if this was not done, the thief himself had to be killed by the first thief who found out about it. Manipulation of the contingent became another important tactic. Prisoners were moved around like troops on a battlefield. Bitches were concentrated in certain camps where they could suppress the local thieves numerically and organizationally. After the cleansing, such a group was transferred to the next hotbed of resistance. Mass transfers were used to form strike units and break up stable groups of thieves. However, by 1952, the situation began to change. The escalation of force could not continue indefinitely because ideological enemies were running out. The key opponents in this conflict, ideological bitches and ideological thieves, practically wiped each other out during the fierce confrontations. The mutual elimination of the most irreconcilable and principled participants on both sides became the main reason for the decline in hostility. Those who survived these bloody clashes no longer had such clear and radical differences in beliefs as their predecessors. The remaining groups, although formerly belonging to different fronts, no longer had the same desire to continue killing each other. In fact, the very ideological basis, the irreconcilability that initially fueled and inflamed the bitch wars, had disappeared. Having lost this basis, the conflict lost its main fuel and began to naturally fade away. In fact, by the time of Stalin's death, the bitch wars had ended, eliminating their own cause. Did the thieves remain? Yes, they did, but their fundamental principles had changed significantly. They no longer rejected interaction with the state altogether. And so the bloody whirlwinds of the bitch wars died down, leaving behind a void of burnt ideals. A different kind of criminal emerged from this crucible. They learned not to reject the state, but to seep into its cracks, to find common ground with the shadow of power for the sake of profit. This criminal element sought to take its place in power rather than fight against it. The Gulag system greatly helped to spread these beliefs throughout the Union, where criminals who had served their sentences began to return to society. People from all over the USSR were imprisoned in one place, and when they were released, They returned to their previous places of residence. As a result, people with the same value system returned from prison to Minsk St. Petersburg, Moscow, Nizhny Tagil, and Ivanovo, and they continued to apply these concepts after returning home. In fact, prison acted as a kind of university where training took place, and then all its graduates dispersed throughout the country. New so-called laws, born somewhere between the barracks and the prison bunks, began to take root on the outside. Before moving on to the further history of the evolution of the thieves movement, it's worth talking about their internal workings, which we omitted earlier. Let's start with language. Fenya, or thieves music, as it was called during its heyday, was the lifeblood and main marker of the thieves' world. Its essence is perfectly reflected in the Russian proverb, "The tongue will take you to Kiev." For a thief, it led to his own particular city of crime, a world of the chosen different from the world of non-criminal freres. Fenya was a mirror of the environment, its values and specialization. Just as northern peoples have dozens of words for snow, thieves had terms for the smallest nuances of their craft. To stay on brand meant to specialize in thefts on buses. To keep a hold meant to trade at train stations. The verb to knock acquired its criminal meaning, to pass information to the other side, not by accident. In the camps, news was often conveyed literally by knocking on the walls of cells and barracks. But the main division enshrined in the language was hierarchical and, one might even say, anthropological. A person's name on the Fenya indicated their status, determined their capabilities and authority, and the very fact that they spoke this language gave them the right to speak and guaranteed that they would be heard. Fenya introduced the following key gradations of people. The highest position was occupied by the blatny. These included the Thieves-in-Law, the highest authorities, Smotrayaski, or overseers, Polozinci, or shot-callers, and Arrestantie, or arrestees. The thieves appointed the Polozinci, who were the direct representatives of the thieves in a particular prison and sometimes in a particular region. The shot-caller was responsible for ensuring compliance with unspoken rules. The shot-callers and, in rare cases, the thieves appointed the overseers. This was an unspoken position in a specific facility, which could be either the entire prison or a small block. Prisoners, who may be called Zulik, Bosiek, Pravilny, can be called the elites of the professional crime world without a specific position. They were respected criminals who lived strictly by the code. They did not have formal administrative powers like a shot-caller or overseer. Their strength lied in their personal authority, knowledge of the laws, and background. They were respected, could influence decisions, were the backbone of the thieves community, and were potential candidates for positions or even thieves-in-law. Below them were the muziki, the most numerous group. These were neutral criminals who did not claim power and avoided conflict, but also did not cooperate openly and actively with the camp administration. Some authoritative muziki had pretty serious influence in prison society. Muziki rarely moved into the category of blatny, even if they had authority, since they did not initially have such a goal. The most difficult class were those who cooperated with the administration. The term goats is often used, but this concept is mainly used in relation to activists who held positions and had a certain amount of power. Their status changed significantly during the Soviet period. Sometimes goats and bitches were lumped together, which is not entirely correct. Historically, bitches were those who followed the thieves' code but switched sides to the prison authorities, not just anyone who supported them. Although during the bitch wars, the situation reached the point of whoever is not with us is against us. This principle quickly ceased to be widely applied. The lowest untouchable caste was made up of the oppressed. They ended up there for serious violations of the concepts or by force. They did the dirtiest work and any mutual contact with them was prohibited. The status of opushkanyi, or outcast, was eternal and could not be mended. Understanding the approximate hierarchy and the complexity of defining it makes it easier to assess the significance of structured criminal language. The roots of Fenya are slightly older than those of Soviet thieves. Early forms of argot were fragmented. It was the jargon of individual gangs or regional groups. Fenya never completely replaced the Russian language, but created a parallel lexicon. New words, new meanings for old words, phrases with figurative meanings. The practical value of Fenya was enormous. First of all, it was a code that was incomprehensible to outsiders. The cant protected against the infiltration of government agents and served as a demarcation line, a disturbing symbol of belonging to another world. But most importantly, Fenya was an alternative to identity verification. Anyone who wanted to make a career in the underworld had to learn and use it. This automatically meant that this person had been taught by someone, that someone was willing to vouch for him, even if the guarantor was very far away. Knowing Fenya was like openly showing off your status and understanding the thieves' laws that society lived by. That's why all the attempts by the authorities to get rid of thief music failed. On the contrary, the more the authorities fought against Fenya and emphasized its anti-Soviet nature, the more power it gave to people who were united by this language. The heyday and unification of Fenya came in the first half of the 20th century, becoming the fruit of the Gulag system. Mass arrests, long stays in overcrowded train cars, constant transfers between camps, all this mixed thugs from all over the country. In these hellish universities, professional thieves, often held separately, especially during such stays, had the opportunity to communicate and unify their language. Fenya reached an unprecedented degree of standardization, becoming a truly nationwide language for criminals. It absorbed camp jargon and a powerful layer of Russian profanity, becoming a real symbol of the strong and hardened thieves' identity. However, from the late 1950s when the gulags began to open and the thieves were released, Fenya began to change. It lost its function as a sharp dividing line between worlds. New generations of bandits made their fortunes in collusion with corrupt officials. The boundaries blurred, and the language itself blurred, acquiring many regional features. By the 70s, the homogeneity of the Fenya had fallen, and the exclusivity of the dialect had weakened. Yes, it still played a role, but more as prison slang spoken by many rather than as a special language of thieves that allowed them to emphasize their distance from the world. However, even a secret language still needs to be used correctly, while another status symbol had to be visible to everyone. For thieves, this became special tattoos. Tattoos became a criminal's visual chronicle, a passport, and a battlefield. The body became a canvas for demonstrating a total break with the world of frayers and the state. The tools used emphasized masculinity and readiness for suffering. Tattoos in the camps were made with blunt needles disinfected with fire. The ink was completely different, often made from soot. The process was painful and dangerous. There are several known cases of thieves dying from infection after unsuccessful tattooing. A true thief had to endure pain and risk with fortitude, showing complete detachment from the norms of the non-criminal world. In the criminal milieu of the 1940s and 50s, thieves-in-law were usually identified by two 8-pointed stars tattooed on their shoulders. Similar tattoos on the knees were interpreted as a refusal to bow down, as if to say, "I will not kneel before the court or before other criminals." Later, crosses with card suits inscribed in them began to prevail as a sign of belonging to those so-called authorities. There are an incredible number of tattoo dictionaries, but they did not have a uniform meaning across the Soviet Union and could vary significantly from region to region, and more importantly, from time to time. Tattoo artists enjoyed a privileged position in the camps. They were valued as craftsmen capable of finding or creating tools and paints, but most importantly as sacred chroniclers who recorded the history and ambitions of the thieves on their bodies. A talented craftsman, even if he was a musik or a political, received protection from the thieves. American communist Thomas Scovio, who was arrested in the USSR in 1938 and sent to Kolyma, survived precisely because of his ability to tattoo, winning the favor and support of outlaws. However, those who dared to apply an undeserved tattoo risked their lives. The death of Joseph Stalin in March 1953 had a serious impact on the entire history of the USSR. Naturally, it could not fail to affect the crime world. Of course, it was not so much the death itself as the mass amnesty that followed, initiated by the new leadership and formally signed by the head of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, Levintry Beria. It led to the release of about 5 million people. This measure, which at first glance seemed humane and was intended to relieve the economically inefficient and politically ambiguous Gulag system, had enormous and often catastrophic consequences for the structure and ideology of organized crime. It did not simply release people into freedom. It threw into Soviet society Already fragile after the war, a huge mass of people whose ties to normal life had been brutally severed and whose survival skills had been formed in the harsh conditions of the prison camps. An incredible number of former prisoners found themselves facing total instability. No housing, no documents, no work, no social support. Often ex-prisoners had no idea what to do or how to do it once they were free. The state, which initiated the amnesty, was completely unprepared for the reintegration. Cities and towns were flooded with people hardened by camp life. With their distinct language and abundant tattoos, naturally, this did not contribute to their integration into society, but it did help them form groups and engage again in criminal activity. The result was an immediate and sharp surge in street crime and chaos. The number of reported crimes jumped from 552,000 in 1953 to 745,000 in 1957. This chaos allowed outlaw connections to be quickly reestablished and new criminal conflicts to arise, now outside the camps, between old enemies. Recognition of the inefficiency of the Gulag system led not only to amnesty, but also to systematic, albeit slow, reforms of the penitentiary system. The camps were gradually transformed into correctional labor colonies, ITK, and the lockdown regime was formally softened. This easing of the punitive pressure was caused both by the economic inexpediency of the huge camp system, which was depleting resources, and by the desire of the new Khrushchev-era elite to distance themselves from Stalin's terror, especially after the revelations of the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, CPSU, in 1956. However, this liberal impulse in penitentiary policy did not lead to what the top leadership had expected. The weakening of administrative control within the ITK themselves meant that power over the daily lives of inmates often passed to criminal authorities. As Mikhail Kolodov, Deputy Minister of Internal Affairs of the USSR, bitterly noted in 1957, often it's not the administration that runs the camps, but repeat offenders. Outside the Blatnie also encountered a new type of criminal, the so-called Tsekoviks, key figures in the underground economy, with their money, business acumen, connections with the corrupt officials, and a model of enrichment, not through robbery or theft, but production and speculation, that was incomprehensible to traditional thieves. The Tsekovki represented both a threat to the old order and a new, tempting resource. The Tsekoviks, initially alien to the world of thieves, but deeply integrated into the state system through corruption, acted as a kind of temper. Initially, they were simply the targets of crime. But over time, the thieves and Tsekoviki began to form a shadow economy where they gradually grew closer. This process, which lasted for a decade, brought thieves enormous wealth and new power. It was precisely this colossal amount of money, which was the result of cooperation with the Tsekoviks, that inevitably led the Thieves-in-Law to direct contacts and merging with corrupt state structures, increasingly undermining the foundations of the old concepts. It's one thing to be an irreconcilable enemy of the state when you're sitting in the Gulag, but quite another when you have millions of Soviet rubles, which give you both power and new challenges. The traditional institution of the Obshak, Common Fund, underwent a fundamental transformation in the conditions of post-Stalin liberalization and the explosive growth of the shadow economy, acquiring new, more powerful sources of funding and functions. Historically, the Common Fund existed to support inmates and bribe the camp administration. It was replenished through theft outside the camp and mandatory deductions from prisoners' so-called income. After 1953, with the release of a huge number of those with thieves' ideology and the growth of underground entrepreneurship, the Common Fund began to extend beyond the prison walls. The persecution of black market figures by gangs such as Mongol, Gennady Kharkov's Moscow group, became a key phenomenon. Mongol, who had the status of a thief-in-law, radically changed his tactics after his release from another prison stint in 1962. He switched from traditional banditry to routine racketeering of Moscow's Tsekoviks. His gang used police uniforms for fake raids, kidnapped underground businessmen, subjected them to sophisticated torture, and extorted money. This was no longer just a series of robberies. It was a primitive but increasingly systematic attempt to control a new, rapidly growing, and greatly profitable source of illegal income. Although Mongol was summoned to a thieves' meeting to answer for his departure from Thieves' Law, No punishment followed, and it was later decided that it was not only possible but necessary to milk the Sekovics. As the Sekovics possessed considerable wealth, such as the legendary currency dealer Yon Rokotov, whose fortune was estimated at 20 million rubles before his execution in 1961, but lacked legal protection and were vulnerable both to state prosecution under articles for speculation or theft of socialist property, as well as the lawlessness of competitors. They were an ideal target for extortion. Although the common fund has still functioned mainly in the old way, the emergence of such a powerful external source of financing as underground entrepreneurs was the first tentative step toward its qualitative evolution. The Obshak began to transform from a mutual aid fund and internal workshop budget into an economic instrument of influence, investment, and control over the new emerging criminal entrepreneurial environment. This laid the foundation for the future deep symbiosis of organized crime and the shadow economy, where the Obshak would become not just a fund, but capital serving complex financial flows and corruption schemes. This would be another stage in the evolution of the thieves, who had less and less in common with the ones who originally gave them that name. In the purely criminal world, the thieves expanded their influence. With the release of a huge number of prisoners, the organized prison structure was also released with them. In the mid-1960s, thieves began to exert control over malina, illegal hideouts, apartments, and dens that served as bases for meetings, storage of loot, and concealment. These locations became hubs of the emerging crime network. The appointment of smotrayashki, or overseer, authorized representatives of the thieves community in cities or regions, took place through criminal meetings or on the instructions of influential thieves-in-law, who often maintained connections with the camps. The overseer was responsible for maintaining order in the territory entrusted to him, resolving disputes between groups, collecting for the common fund, and maintaining contact with both prisoners and local repeat offenders and the backbone of street gangs. This system created a vertical management structure that permeated the space from labor colonies to large cities. This was an innovation, the formation of a conditionally unified organization represented throughout the USSR, which was gaining more and more power. However, it's worth noting that the thieves did not control crime. As it may sometimes seem, they exercised a certain control over the system and could make decisions as elders, who were usually listened to. The arbitration function that had previously existed in the gulags finally came to the fore in the 1970s. The thieves and overseers began to resolve disputes between outlaw groups, bandits, and Sekovics, establishing rules and punishing violators. And here, the point was not that thieves were strong and forced everyone to obey them, but that criminal society had a very real need for external arbitration, which allowed it to avoid sliding into the chaos of constant hostility. Surprisingly, despite the fact that thieves were becoming stronger and their influence was at its peak by the 1970s, it was during this period that the idea of thieves-in-law, at least those who had survived Stalin's camps, began to decline completely and irrevocably. The reason was a violation of ideology. Yes, thieves had power. Yes, thieves' concepts went into the people. But that tradition, that code of thieves-in-law, practically ceased to exist. Few knew and observed it. It simply ceased to apply to a rapidly changing society, including the very society of thieves. The sharp growth of criminal networks in the 60s led to the regionalization and fragmentation of the thieves system in the early 70s. But it was created for a different purpose, so that any thief could find himself anywhere in the country and receive the respect, power, and influence he deserved. It was like the army, where a transferred officer immediately receives all formal power and the right to give orders. Only the criminal world is not an army, and there were fewer and fewer people willing to share power. Crime itself in the 1970s did not differ significantly from other decades. There have always been criminals, there are now and always will be, but organized forms changed quickly, and thieves lost another important feature, the aura of former glory and mythologization of their image. You'll remember that the extreme cruelty during the gang wars was primarily caused by the need to intimidate others. When intimidation did not work, both thieves and bitches could face harsh retaliation from any other camp group. Competent intimidation and belief in one's own omnipotence were the most important tools of thieves. And the further in time we go, the more it fails. The thieves' world, in the classical sense, was weakening and eroding. In the 1970s and 80s, Soviet crime responded to this with a surge in street gangs and a strong emphasis on regionalism. The most striking example of this is the Kazan phenomenon. Aggressive young people deprived of a clear path into the hierarchical thieves world of the Stalin era united on a torrential basis in courtyards, neighborhoods, micro-districts, into tightly structured communities. The offices, as they called themselves, were built on a strict age hierarchy, from the shells, the youngest, through the superiors and youth to the elders and authorities, the leaders. This structure was cemented by hardened discipline, collective responsibility, and a cult of power. The financial basis was the obshak, funded by voluntary contributions, levies on non-members of the offices, and criminal proceeds. The gangs waged asphalt wars for control of territories, which claimed the lives of many young men. Other cities across the Soviet Union had similar situations. In Moscow, as participants recalled, entire neighborhoods were divided between rival teams, and their clashes could involve up to 100 people. The thieves themselves had virtually no influence on the type of gangs, because they did not have enough power. But the gangs did not emerge in open confrontation with the thieves either. Paradoxically, the Soviet state itself became the unwitting architect of the conditions for the survival and even revival of organized crime during this period. The police and the KGB had a powerful repressive apparatus capable of crushing any group that openly challenged the order. However, the state was deeply corrupt and increasingly dependent on the black market, which satisfied the needs of both the elite and ordinary citizens. A shadow triad emerged: corporate officials, gangsters, and sekoviks. The authorities pursued a policy of an unspoken social contract called a little deal by Western Sovietologists. This meant that the population, in the broad sense, was allowed to commit minor crimes, primarily of an economic nature, such as bribery, all of which reached unprecedented heights in the 1970s. These actions became normal and practically lost any social condemnation. Naturally, the criminal element of society used these same resources much more intensively, sometimes disguising large and serious schemes as minor crimes. Moreover, in the 1970s, these schemes reached incredible proportions. The best example is the story of Vory Lajishvili. The famous Georgian Sekovik achieved his influence largely thanks to his exceptionally close, almost symbiotic ties with Vasil Mazovanidze, who headed the Communist Party of Georgia as its first secretary of the Central Committee from 1953 to 1972. Starting in the late 60s, Lajishvili built an extensive commercial network that parasitized on the resources of the state economy. He created many illegal factories and workshops, often located directly on the territory of official Soviet factories. These underground workshops produced a wide range of goods, from simple shopping bags to raincoats. The raw materials of them were obtained through deliberately inflated orders by the heads of the state-owned enterprises, who then wrote off the surplus as production defects or losses. The finished products were secretly distributed throughout the USSR. Although Lajishvili generously handed out bribes at all levels, his real protection and patron was Mazovanidze. In return, the first secretary and his wife Victoria received a constant stream of expensive gifts and everything they needed for the luxurious lifestyle to which they quickly became accustomed. Lajishvili himself enjoyed a wealth and a sense of complete impunity. It was said that he could fly to Moscow for a Dynamo Tbilisi match and bet thousands of rubles on their victory, an amount equal to a worker's annual salary. In the 1970s, the money in the shadow economy was so extensive that thieves simply could not ignore it and fundamentally revised their relationship with racketeering and robbery to protection. The peak of the formalization of relations between the world of organized crime and the shadow economy was the meeting in Pyatigorsk in 1979. At this meeting, criminal leaders and representatives of the Sekoviks reached an agreement. The shadow economy received guarantees of security and peaceful conduct of business, in exchange for regular payments of a tax to the gangsters, something like a tithe of their income. This agreement was a key moment. Not only did it stabilize the criminal environment by reducing spontaneous violence such as that practiced by Mongol, but it also created a legitimate basis for the activities of various organized crime groups as intermediaries between thieves and shadow economy operators, since there were no longer that many thieves left. If in the early 1950s there were so many of them that they physically fought with bitches in the camps, by the 80s the thieves were at the top knot even of single gangs. But sometimes of the very structure of the criminal world, without being part of any specific gang, they simply could no longer physically control the incredible scale of the shadow economy. Moreover, the gangsters adopting the very methods of the CPSU began to hold meetings to resolve internal issues and coordinate actions, which spoke well of their growing ambitions. According to some evidence, state structures knew about the Congress in Pyatigorsk and may have turned a blind eye to it, seeing it as a tool for bringing order to the shadow sector. The most significant change in the 80s was the substantial distancing of camp thieves from thieves on the outside. This was not the same situation as between 1947 and 1953. There was no confrontation, their paths simply diverged. Thieves on the outside did not want to go to prison. They had money, power, comfort, and a life that was becoming increasingly free. A thief behind bars had enormous power and authority within the prison, sometimes even ruling it, so to speak. But he lost his power on the outside when he was imprisoned. Life was accelerating at a tremendous pace, and crime leaders in distant camps very quickly lost their significance. Gorbachev's reforms were the final nail in the coffin of the existing system. His actions disrupted the more or less established order and created unique conditions for a substantial rise in crime. However, let's be honest, this had been 20 years in the making, and it's unlikely that even other actions by the head of state could have radically changed the situation. Nevertheless, his decisions proved to be extremely successful for organized crime. First and foremost, of course, was the anti-alcohol campaign. All over the world, attempts to introduce another version of prohibition led only to one result: the enrichment of outlaws. The USSR was no exception, where numerous local bootleggers actively took advantage of prohibition. The second factor was the sharp liberalization of the economy. When cooperatives appeared but their legal framework and actual practice remained extremely vague. Of course, business got a boost, but so did crime, as criminals reverted to good old racketeering and learned about money laundering. The third influential factor of Gorbachev's policy was a blow to what is sometimes called the police state, to the system of control by security forces. In a completely absurd way, literally in an instant, the system of state security structures lost its teeth and the criminal bloc acquired them. There was also a fourth factor, which did not directly depend on Gorbachev, but had a very serious impact on the situation. This was the war in Afghanistan and the return of soldiers home. They returned to a homeland that was not ready to welcome them, was not ready to help them, but they were welcomed by various illegal elements. Let's start with the first factor and take a closer look at the rest. The problem of alcoholism was real and terrible. By the early 1980s, the average Soviet citizen drank about 11.2 liters, about 3 gallons, of pure alcohol per year. An average family spent up to half its budget on booze. Drunkenness crippled lives, reduced labor productivity to catastrophic levels, and overflowed hospitals. Gorbachev, unlike his predecessors, was practically abstinent. In 1985, he forced the Central Committee of the Communist Party to adopt a resolution on combating drunkenness and alcoholism. The plan seemed comprehensive: sharply increase alcohol prices, restrict the time and places of sale, toughen penalties for drunkenness in public, launch a campaign promoting a healthy lifestyle, develop the production of non-alcoholic beverages, open milk bars, and combat the sources of alcohol, for example, by cutting down excess vineyards. In practice, the campaign turned into a farce with tragic consequences. The authoritarian system proved to be inflexible. No good alternatives appeared. Boring propaganda was ignored, and the cutting down of vineyards caused enormous damage to agriculture. Paradoxically, some of the campaign's goals were achieved. Absenteeism related to drunkenness decreased by 30%, and the mortality rate from drunk driving decreased by 20% between 1984 and 1987. However, the price of these successes was enormous. For millions of Soviet people, alcohol was not just a bad habit, but the main, albeit destructive, way to escape the dullness, hopelessness, and total deprivation of everyday life. Deprived of legal access to alcohol, the people rushed en masse to the black market. Demand for underground alcohol skyrocketed. Sekoviks, the underground producers, and mainly organized criminal groups with years of experience in informal economy entered the scene. They gladly filled the vacuum. This was done through the import of contraband alcohol from abroad, mass theft from the few remaining state-owned production facilities and warehouses, the production and sale of moonshine and surrogates, as well as fraud involving government resources, when corrupt officials stole batches of alcohol intended for destruction and sold it on the black market through gangsters. Moonshining took on enormous popular proportions. It was brewed everywhere, in barns, at dacha cottages, in city bathrooms. Gangsters also helped sell the surplus to those who produced more than they could consume themselves, naturally for a certain percentage. The anti-alcohol campaign achieved the unthinkable. It changed the attitude of ordinary citizens towards professional criminals. Previously, thieves were distant and far away, and ordinary, law-abiding citizens had virtually no chance of encountering them, except perhaps in the gulag system. Now, however, they became key suppliers of a vitally important commodity. For most people, this was their first conscious contact with representatives of the criminal world as non-victims. Gangsters became major traders, and these traders began to earn unprecedented money in their new, unexpected role as friends and allies. Naturally, the Thieves-in-Law did not personally deliver the goods, but the thieves' people had roughly the same status as the thieves for the average person, who often did not understand the difference, nor were they supposed to. One former petty criminal, let's call him Six, recalled the surreal feeling of traveling with one such authority figure through the Chertonovo residential district in Moscow. People were happy to see us. They smiled and joked. They constantly offered us cigarettes and asked what we had that was interesting that day, as if we were Sikovics. Criminals who started with booze quickly expanded their range of goods, using their connections. In conditions of total shortages and a ration card system, they became a source of everything from fashionable jeans and cigarettes to scarce medicines and spare parts. It wasn't that Soviet people were unfamiliar with corruption or the black market. The issue was access and trust. Where could an ordinary person find the right official to bribe? How could they find the going rate for corruption? Criminals cleverly filled this niche as intermediaries. They could establish the necessary connections with a corrupt official, store manager, or head of an institution, quietly, though sometimes openly, guarantee the success of the deal, and ensure safety, or conversely, use force in case of non-payment. They were interested in everything going smoothly. Their reputation and future business depended on it. The same Six from Chertonovo recounted how the residents themselves pushed the gangsters to expand their supplies. "Guys, thanks for the booze, but next time can you bring some imported cigarettes?" It was a shock for a petty criminal to suddenly feel like an all-powerful wholesaler and shot caller. And for his bosses, in addition to fabulous profits, this brought something unexpected: a sense of social significance from ordinary residents. They appreciated the new opportunities that Mikhail Gorbachev had unwittingly opened up for them. Gorbachev's anti-alcohol campaign, conceived as a blessing, became a powerful criminogenic factor, but cooperatives were already looming on the horizon, a new gold mine for the gangster business. By the mid-1980s, the USSR leadership realized the deep crisis of the planned economy. Previous attempts to accelerate it under party control had failed. In this situation, partly influenced by the historical experience of the NEP, an attempt was made to legalize private initiative through the creation of cooperatives. These small private enterprises became the legal successors to the former underground Sikovics. Initially, they focused on the service sector, but quickly expanded into trade and manufacturing. The emergence of the cooperatives seemed to be a boon for the economy, introducing market elements and partially solving the problem of shortages. In practice, however, cooperatives found themselves in an extremely vulnerable position, creating ideal conditions for the criminalization of this sector. Unlike the former Sikovics, who had years of unspoken connections and protection mechanisms, the new cooperators had neither stable contacts with officials, nor protection, nor experience in resisting pressure. Their activities caused mass discontent among the population, whose standard of living was falling. Cooperatives offered better quality and service, but at market prices, which meant high prices, and this was perceived with speculation. The authorities and the police also treated the cooperatives with hostility, seeing them as a threat to the established, albeit corrupt, distribution system. Local officials sabotaged their work through administrative methods. The police often deliberately refused to protect cooperative members, not wanting to spoil relations with local clans or superiors who disapproved of the cooperatives. The resulting vacuum of power and protection was immediately filled by criminal groups that had already accumulated significant capital on the wave of the anti-alcohol campaign. They saw the cooperatives as an opportunity to launder money, invest in the legal or semi-legal sector, control a new promising segment of the economy, and subjugate vulnerable entrepreneurs. Racketeering or protection rackets flourished. The demand for protection was enormous, and the supply from gangsters was happy to meet it. By the end of 1989, according to various estimates, criminals controlled approximately 75% of cooperatives. It is important to note that the economic boom was so great that the main shadow authorities practically did not interfere in grassroots business. They simply didn't need to. It was already impossible to imagine a situation in which a thief-in-law would solve the problems of some small cooperative. The thieves resolved issues of gang relations, decisions that required participation of entire ministries. At the grassroots level, various authorities often acted on behalf of the thieves, not the highest, but still not the lowest unit of the criminal structure. Another transformation of the system took place. Highly organized crime appeared in the truest sense of the word. The thieves finally moved away from the concepts that had once arisen in the Stalinist camp system. The thieves repeated the fate of the Communist Party in a most amusing way. First, they formed under difficult conditions. Then they endured a serious crisis. After that, they expanded their power and began to slowly but surely devour themselves, changing pursued by reality. The generation of outlaws either adapted, mastering financial schemes and racketeering, or gave way to a new, more businesslike type of bandit. They no longer needed the classic concepts, nor did they need physical strength. They needed capital, connections, and the ability to negotiate. The new, more organized gangs were made up of people from three key groups. The Soviet system of training athletes, having lost its funding, left many talented wrestlers, boxers, and weightlifters without prospects. Official and underground sports clubs became a breeding ground for racketeers. And then there were the veterans who had returned from Afghanistan, betrayed by the state, deprived of their promised housing, jobs, and medical care, who were left feeling like criminals. Some of them tried to join legal structures, security organizations, the police. But the crisis pushed many into gangs that highly valued their discipline, skills, and willingness to use violence. While shadowy structures were growing stronger and becoming more organized, the Soviet system was in agony. The glasnost policy of openness and transparency undermined the party's legitimacy, economic reforms failed, and nationalist movements destabilized the country. Roles changed dramatically. Officials, sensing the collapse of the system, feared for the future, needed the services of gangsters to ensure the right results in elections and quick enrichment for a rainy day, and were too busy fighting for power at the top to control crime. By the time the Soviet Union collapsed, organized crime had ceased to be a marginal phenomenon, in the traditional sense, and had become a powerful force. It controlled key sectors of the nascent business world, had extensive racketeering and money laundering networks, had an army of security forces at its disposal, and infiltrated relationships with corrupt officials who now depended on it. The collapse of the state did not destroy organized crime groups, but gave them unprecedented freedom, removing even the previous limited restraints. The 1990s began, and crime reached unparalleled levels, which was inevitable because in Soviet times, the system itself had done everything to make it happen. And what about the thieves? The thieves who had formed in Stalin's camps, who were ready to give their lives but not to violate their ideals or cooperate with authorities, simply did not endure. They were not destroyed, they had simply outlived their usefulness. And the point here was not about the bitch wars or the actions of law enforcement agencies. Thieves, as a separate caste, have been completely reborn. They've become the leaders of the crime world, the leaders of large and serious gangs. If in the Stalin era or in the years of the bitch wars, thieves were defined by their status, by the Finnya language, and by certain principles, then the further we go in time, the more they are defined by money, by connections in the party and government, by connections in the security forces, and by the power they wield. Prison culture played a huge role in criminalization of the population, flourishing more and more as the decline of the Soviet Union became more apparent. But this culture influenced the lower members of the crime community. The top leaders of the underworld were on a different level of decision-making. Often in memories of the 1970s or 80s, thieves behind bars are mentioned as people who had no contact with ordinary prisoners, who would not even talk to any blatnie, but at the same time they wielded enormous power, and their word could decide a lot in prison, and even beyond its walls. These memories are quite accurate in essence, and well reflect the transition of the status of thieves from direct participants in events to those who possess status, knowledge, and a far greater power than can be gathered in the hands of one person. In the 90s, thieves faced their final transformation, when the new-style power gangs, consisting of fighters and lawless individuals of all stripes who spat on all laws and took power by force, gained enormous power. The thieves would have to take this blow and respond to it or accept these guys, once again changing their own community, which, as you already know, is very flexible under the pressure of change.